Good evening, and welcome to the Belmont Historic Society September 2014 program. My name is Emilio Imaro Jr., and I'm the president of the Belmont Historical Society. Before we begin tonight, I would like to thank our vice president and program director, Lois Farrell, for all her hard work to organize our program tonight, the Belmont Media Center for recording this event, and Gloria Bushman for organizing the refreshments that will be served after the program. As a quick reminder, the Belmont Historic Society will be having an open house at our Wellington Hill Station, which is located at 2 Common Street here in Belmont, this Sunday, September 21st from 2 to 4 p.m. We hope to see you all there. To learn more about our organization and if you'd like to join our organization, please visit our website, www.belmonthistoricalsociety.org. Our program tonight is about the life of Francis Cabot Lowell, a Boston area industrialist who led the way in America's Industrial Revolution. Our speaker tonight, Mike Rosenberg, was a longtime resident of the Boston area before moving to Chicago. And while in Boston, he was inspired by the legacy of our area's industrial history that he saw in many of the historic buildings in this area. Following a career in medicine, he began to study and write about the development of industry in America. As we will learn tonight, much of that development has its roots in eastern Massachusetts. Mr. Rosenberg's book, The Life and Times of Francis Cabot Lowell, 1775 to 1817, will be the focus of tonight's lecture and will also be on sale tonight after the program. We're happy to have him here with us. Please help me welcome Mike Rosenberg.
Was he speaking about me? Anyway, first of all, let me explain. I'm wearing a cap because I had surgery a couple of weeks ago, so it's not an affectation, so forgive me. And the story tonight is the life and times of Francis Cabot Lowell, born in Newburyport and raised in Boston, where he lived most of his life, and died at age 42. This has nothing to do with the Scottish election tomorrow about the virtues or vices of independence. But let me start this lecture by saying that from what I've read, the Massachusetts or New England in general had a tremendous burst of creativity after the Declaration of Independence, particularly after the war was declared over in 1783. And the period that Francis Cabot Lowell lived was the period of this great exploration of Yankees doing all kinds of things. Now, for example, the one thing they did was this famous boat, the Columbia, that left Boston in 1790 and made its way down the coast of North America, all the way down the coast of South America, around Cape Horn, up the other side of the 2 continents, until it reached the Midwest, and then he discovered this famous river, which he called Columbia, after his boat. And from there he went on to China via Hawaii. And he went right around the world. The first American boat to go around the world came out of Boston, returned 4 or 5 years later, and set out again within months after that. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, he determined how wide America was. So when President Jefferson decided to send these 2 men, Lewis and Clark, around to explore the country, they knew the dimensions of the country. They knew the east and then knew the west. They didn't know too much about the middle. So this is one of the consequences of the Massachusetts Age of Discovery, as I call it. And in this context, Francis Cabot Lowell did what he did. And my lecture tonight just to explain what this typical Bostonian did to create the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. This is what he did. Now, if I were to go on a walk with some of you, it would take us maybe an hour and a half to walk to Waltham, to the Charles River. I'm sure you've all seen this building, although it's changed. This is in Waltham, Massachusetts, just off Moody Street. Anyone knows where that is? Yeah. Okay, and now if you go to the bridge where Moody Street crosses the Charles River, and you peep over the side of the bridge looking east, you'll see the waterfall. Now, why is this important? Because when you wanted power in the late 18th century, the power came either from sail or from human activity, or it came from water. And to power a machinery, what you needed was a waterfall, because the waterfall created the power, and they would have a sluice gate just off the waterfall to go into the machine room and turn the water wheel, which then turned the machines. So if you think of it, for those of you who are from this area, the only waterfall of any consequence from Boston is this one in Waltham. It's about 8 or 9 miles as the crow flies. So when Francis Cabot Lowell, living in Boston, was looking for a water supply, a water power supply, the most obvious place was in Waltham, which would take about maybe half a day on horseback to reach. And there was, in fact, a mill there, a wood mill, and he bought the wood mill, and he measured the waterfall, which is about 17, 18 feet from the top to the bottom. You know where Grover Cronin is?
Yeah.
Well, it's that area. And what the waterfall did, when you build up a waterfall, then you create a dam in back of it. And the dams are the water supply in times of low rainfall, so that you could have a water supply to feed the waterfall, to feed the sluice gate, to feed the water wheel, to keep the machines running year round. So that's what they did. And if you look around in New England, you'll find a fair number of these dams built near a waterfall, and the dams are the supply of power in a sense. And this is what was significant about Waltham. So that's why from here it's about 5-10 minute ride when it's not too busy, and you can get to Waltham and see this building, which has been changed, because since this building was built in 1814, which is over 200 years ago, just a couple of months ago, it's been expanded by another building here and yet another building there. But this is the original building, and apparently the picture of it is in the Gore house, in the Gore estate. So I have not seen it, but the original picture is there. So this here is the Charles River down in the gully, and these are two guys having a look at it, and the water wheel would be about there, and the factory that Francis Cabot Lowell designed and had built, mostly with his own money, was 5 stories high, and the raw cotton would come in one end, be spun into thread, and the thread would be woven into cloth, all in one building. And that was it may seem trite now, but that was the genius of Francis Cabot Lowell. Now, where did he get the idea from? Well, he got it from Great Britain. In 1810, he and his wife and 4 children went on a gentleman's tour of Europe. And the intention was they would go to England and then up to Scotland and then to Wales and then from London go to the continent. But that was the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and he couldn't get a visa or whatever you needed then to cross over into Europe. So he spent almost 2 years, or just over 2 years, in England and Wales, and he apparently, although there's no documentation that I could find, he scooted around and he looked around to see what was happening in England that he could bring back to the United States. And he was living in Edinburgh for about 6 months, hobnobbing with the high society of Edinburgh. And he may or may not have gone to this mill, which was a water-powered mill, New Lanark it was called. And these were the combination of the factories and the houses for the workers of the mill. So that's where he got the idea from, that you needed a river, a powerful river, that could generate the power to turn the machines, and the machines could both spin, could both spin the cotton, raw cotton into thread, and then weave the thread into textile, into cloth in one building. This is where the idea came from. And so these were the workers' cottages. Now, the thing about England or Britain at that time is that they had tons of workers, because they had a humongous crafting business of people spinning and weaving in their homes. And when the Industrial Revolution came, these people were unemployed, so they came to the factories. And you really had a kind of Dickensian experience of thousands, tens of thousands of workers coming to the factories because they had no work and being employed for next to nothing to work in the factories doing the things they had done at home by hand, and now they were tending to the machines. And the machines, I'll show you who built the machines. The machines did all the work, and the human beings simply fed the machines and made sure the machines were working properly. So that's the Industrial Revolution. It's a bit dehumanizing, but that's how it worked. Now this is he, the only known likeness of Francis Cabot Lowell, taken when he was about 26, 27 years old, the time of his marriage. It was a silhouette, probably cut out. The next picture of his wife-to-be, and they were probably done at the same time. How this survived and nothing else of him did not survive, I don't know. But it's not as if he was too poor to have a picture done, because many of his relatives had elegant portraits done of themselves, because they were upper-class, Harvard-educated, Phillips Andover School boys. Phillips Andover, then Harvard, and they were highly educated, wealthy merchants, or whatever they did, lawyers. And he could easily have had a portrait of himself made, but one does not exist. The next picture is of his gorgeous wife, Hannah Jackson Lowell, and it brings up the combination of the Jacksons and the Lowells. They were John Lowell, Francis Cabot Lowell's father, and Jonathan Jackson went to Harvard together. And they then became the best of friends, went up to Newburyport and lived side by side and raised families side by side. And Francis's best friends were the Jackson boys, and his wife was one of the Jackson girls. He didn't have to go far, but she seemed to be quite a wonderful lady who bore him 4 children and died young, but was a steadfast supporter of him. And this is she, Hannah Jackson Lowell. Now this is his father. This is John Lowell. The 7th, I can't remember, 7th or 8th or 6th or 7th generation of Lowells in America. The Lowells were an English family, maybe originally French, who came to England around the 12th, 13th century. And in 1635, the ancestor of the Lowells came to America and was asked to go up to Newburyport. Why Newburyport? Because it was their frontier, and they were afraid of the Indians and they were afraid of the French coming down. So Winthrop was sending up people to live in Newburyport and to make sure it was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this is the John Lowell, the 6th or 7th generation of Lowells. Went to Harvard around 1760. Graduated and did his articles as a lawyer. In those days there was no law school, so you got another lawyer to work under, and he did that. He found the best lawyer in Boston, became a distinguished lawyer, eventually became a judge, and was a man of great distinction. He made his fortune selling property owned by loyalists who had fled the country, and he was taking a commission, and it seems to have been quite a sizable commission of the property. So he was there at the right time, because people more senior to him were loyalists who fled the country, and this guy wavered whether to join the British or join the Americans. He picked the right side and benefited from it by becoming a pretty wealthy guy, and bought himself a property called Bromley Heath in Roxbury, which then was 8 miles or 5 miles outside of Boston. And what gentlemen did was to have a country house. So he had a house in Boston, and he had a country home in Roxbury. Bromley Heath exists to this day by the same name. It is a housing estate. So you can go and see it anytime you like. But that was he, John Lowell Sr., the father of Francis Cabot Lowell. And he settled, after graduating from Harvard, he settled in Newburyport, which then was a town almost as big as Boston. That's where he settled. And he married 3 times. Yeah. His third wife, I don't have pictures of 1 and 2. But in those days, people died just like that, from pneumonia, diphtheria, whatever illnesses there were. What, childbirth? Yeah. So he had 2 wives before she, and when she became wife number 3, she had 5 stepchildren who were all under 11 years of age, and they regarded her as an angel, and she took care of them, including Francis Cabot Lowell. And there's some lovely letters which I found in the archives of the Mass Historical Society, where he, in his schoolboy handwriting, would write to what he called his dear mama, dearest mama, which is she, and ask her for toothbrushes and for coats and for whatever else he needed. He was then a schoolboy at Phillips Andover, one of the 3rd or 4th classes at Phillips Andover, and he graduated from there at age 13 and went to Harvard at age 13. But this is the 3rd wife of John Lowell, Sr., and her name was Ting, T-Y-N-G, because she was married to Mr. Ting of Tingsboro fame. But her maiden name was Russell, and the Russells came from Charlestown. Her father was a judge in the colonial administration. So she was a dear, and she was, as I said, the 3rd wife of Francis Cabot Lowell. Anyone want to know where I got the picture from?
Yes.
Well, I found it online, but it's in the Amherst College Art Museum. They had no idea who these people were. They still probably don't, but I tried to tell them. But this is she, and she and her husband, the pictures are taken, you can see, go back one, Lynn. They were taken by the same artist, done at the same, probably the same time. Because in those days you didn't have somebody taking your picture, you'd have to get a artist to paint your picture. Okay, next one. And one more. And this is her mother, and the picture's by Copley. Now, John Singleton Copley was a self-taught artist in Boston who had a knack for painting, and you pay him £10 or whatever it costs, and you draw your picture. So it wasn't a great honor, it just you pay him the money and he'd do it. And he did hundreds of them. And this one is in the Art Gallery of North Carolina. And there she is in her silks and finery, a woman of no consequence today other than being linked to some important people in Charlestown and being the mother of Mrs. Lowell the third Mrs. Lowell. The 3rd Mrs. Lowell. Next slide. Okay. Now this is one of the great dandies. Anyone seen this painting? Well, it's in the Museum of Fine Arts. It's in the New American Wing. No one knows who he is, but it's in gorgeous color. It's painted with watercolors rather than oils, I think. And if you go there to the New Wing, and you'll find Jonathan Jackson, a dandy, if ever I've seen one, very self-conscious of his appearance. He had 5 or 6 paintings of him and his one wife and second wife done by Copley. And this is one of them, and the picture in color is quite brilliant and I think quite dandified. And he was, as I said, the best friend of John Lowell Sr. and the father of Hannah Jackson Lowell, who was the wife of Francis Cabot Lowell. And the 2 families lived side by side and were intertwined. Now I'll show you a few more Jacksons. Oh, this is his second wife. His first wife died, if I remember, childless, and she bore him 9 children and then died herself at age 33. I like to say she died of exhaustion, but I'm not sure. I don't know. But she was a Tracy, and Tracy was an Irishman who settled in Newburyport and made a fortune in shipping. But he was an uneducated guy who got intertwined with the Lowells, who were of a higher intellectual level. I don't say a high class, but they were highly educated. And she became the second wife of Jonathan Jackson. The Jacksons originally came from Newton and then moved into Boston. So they are also an old Yankee family. So this is she, and I'll show you some of her children. This is her eldest son, Charles Jackson, who went to Harvard with Francis Cabot Lowell, and they were best of friends. And he became a lawyer and a famous judge in Boston and lived his whole life in Boston. And he later became involved with the Boston Manufacturing Company, the first mill in North America to make cotton. The next brother is James Jackson. He was the chief physician of the Massachusetts General Hospital. I can go into more detail, but he was a very prominent physician around the Back Bay, not Back Bay, around Boston at that time, because there was no Back Bay. And he got involved with the Mass General, and he was the first professor of medicine, although he knew next to nothing. I mean, he had the weirdest, but he knew what everyone else knew at the time. But that was he. He went to England to study and came back, and Francis Cabot Lowell lent him the money to study in England, and he came back to practice in Boston. And the third one is Patrick Tracy Jackson, named for his grandfather. That's the same Patrick Tracy, the Irishman I talked about before. And he, when his father ran out of money, he went to sea, and he traveled the world as a salesman for the goods being put on the ships that the Yankees were selling all around the world.
Is that what they call a supercargo?
Yes. I forgot the word, and thank goodness you remembered it. He was a supercargo it's a word given mainly to a young guy, maybe 18, 19, who, what they do in those days is that they would rent or buy a ship, 6, 7, 8 guys, 8 prominent men, and load up the ship with their goods, and then entrust a young man to make sure the goods reached whatever country, to Europe or India or wherever it was going, and sell the goods at a profit, and then buy whatever he could buy with the money to bring back to America. And they were called the supercargo. And he was a supercargo at age about 14, 15. So they must have trusted him tremendously to deal with what was then vast sums of money. So the Jacksons appear in the story of Francis Cabot Lowell for the whole of his life, because they were engaged in the development of the Boston Manufacturing Company, and this guy in particular in the development of the city of Lowell, which was named for Francis Cabot Lowell, which I'll tell you about as we go along. Okay. Now, Francis Cabot Lowell had 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and the 2 half-brothers. And this is the Reverend Charles Lowell, the youngest of the 3 brothers, the son of Mrs. Lowell III, and he was the Reverend of the West Church near the Mass General Hospital, which still stands to this day. I don't think it's used as a church, but it's there, and that was his church. He was there. He was a minister for a long time. He lived in Cambridge, and his house is now the house of the president of Harvard. So it's on that fancy street where all the lovely homes are, which used to be farm homes up to the river, and then that area was sold in front of them. But what's the street? Mount Auburn? Mount Auburn Street, yeah. Brattle Street. Okay, so that's where his house is, and it's one of not near the Longfellow House, but it's a few blocks away, and that's where he lived. He was, I would say, from what I've read of him, kind of a boring man. And I read his diary, and all he recorded was the daily temperature. He had a fetish about the temperature. So if you want to do research on temperature in 1790, the book is in the collection of the Divinity School at Harvard, and I read it until I fell asleep. And the day his brother died, there's not a mention of his brother being dead, you know. So he had his own thing. But his son was the famous poet, Russell Lowell. So he was a poet. So some good came out of him. The next brother, John Lowell Jr., is the oldest of the 3 from the first wife. And he was a very precocious and cocky fellow who had a thing for John Quincy Adams. They were contemporaries. And John Quincy Adams could not make a success out of his law career because this guy took all the customers. And I've read Quincy Adams's statement saying that he felt it was unfair that because this guy was the son of a rich man, he had the best of it because he took over his father's practice. Now he had his, if I can say, comeuppance in 1802 when he was representing a young man in Dedham who had allegedly killed or may have killed his girlfriend. And the story was that he told his girlfriend was dead and she had been stabbed about 20 times, and he said that she had stabbed herself and that she'd inflicted a wound from her back into her heart to kill herself because she couldn't do it from the front. Well, of course, there was a story that no one believed, and he was found guilty, and this guy, John Lowell, who had won every case in his life, had a kind of a panic attack. And the rest of his life was of this insipid fellow bemoaning his panic attacks or post-traumatic stress disorder. And he never worked again in his life. But luckily his dad died the same year, so he had all the property. And he lived the life of the Lord of the Manor in Bromley Heath, and writing diatribes about the Federalist diatribes, and opposing the South and opposing Louisiana Purchase. And generally, I would say a reactionary and an obnoxious character, but a great writer. And well worth, I wouldn't say well worth reading, but he had opinions about the French Revolution and lots of topics. But he believed that people like him, the Yankees, deserved to rule America, and these upstarts from the South were ruining things. So he was a little bit out of his depth, and when the Louisiana Purchase took place, then he lost his credibility. Okay. And this is a picture of Harvard circa 1790, when Francis Cabot Lowell was a student there. As I said, he was 13 when he got into Harvard out of Phillips Andover. He wrote the examinations, he passed. The classes were then about 25, 30 students per year, just 100 students in the whole school. And the school was endowed by John Harvard, who had left his books and his money to it. It was a small school, but it created a kind of an elitism. And the people who graduated Harvard had three options: to become a minister, to become a merchant, or to become a lawyer. And the three Lowell boys, one was a minister, one was a merchant, and one was a lawyer. And Francis Cabot Lowell became the merchant. Now, in his final year at school, he apparently was mucking around the day before Christmas, and they kicked him out. And they rusticated him, and he had to go to West Bridgewater to complete his studies. But he did graduate with his class, but it played on his mind and transformed him from a kind of a happy-go-lucky rich boy to a very serious man who had to prove his worth. Because his father and his brother gave him a tough time, called him a wastrel, is that the right word? Yeah, sort of a loser, and you better pull up your socks, or else you will come to nothing. And that's how they would treat him. I mean, the idea of success with these Yankees, the need to succeed was extraordinary. But this is the school, and he graduated from there at aged 18 and went and spent a year in France during the French Revolution as a supercargo. He went as a supercargo, stayed for about a year, learned French, and wrote back stories about people being guillotined and people being shot, as if it were just entertainment for him. And he had in his pocket a passport from James Madison, who was then the American ambassador to France. And with this passport, he could go everywhere he liked. And he did. And he just had a jolly good time. His parents were frantic, but he enjoyed himself. And he came back because they said, you have to be serious and you have to start earning money. And he came back to Boston to become a merchant. Now, what was a merchant? Thanks, Linda. Well, this is Long Wharf in Boston. And I'll show you a bigger picture in a moment. And this was the wharf. Alongside the wharf were docks, and alongside the docks were the offices of the merchants. And the merchants would buy things that came from abroad and would sell things from America. So what was the trade? The trade was wood from Massachusetts, corn sent to the West Indies in return for molasses, from which they made rum, and in return for sugar. And then they would sell stuff, mackerel and dried fish, all the way to Europe, and bring back wine and bring back stuff that was desirable, including getting into the India trade, or the East India trade. So there was a West Indies and an East India trade. So this was the Long Wharf, and next to it was India Wharf, where the aquarium now stands. And this is what Francis Cabot Lowell and a few other guys built. They built India Wharf to deal with the India trade, the trade between America. Imagine the distance. America and India, and America and China, America and Japan, and America and Indonesia. Spices and silks and crockery and all that stuff. That Salem was doing the same thing, but it was being done out of Boston. And this is India Wharf, and next to it is a street where the retail trade took place, Broad Street. It's still there in Boston now. But so they built, this is what Francis Cabot Lowell built, both India Wharf and Broad Street. So that's where the goods came in, and this is where the goods were sold. So pretty savvy. Cost a lot of money, but they had to build the wharf, and the whole thing cost thousands of pounds, thousands of dollars even then. How they got the money, it was a complicated thing. They had partnerships. Next picture. And this is how Boston looks. You probably know the picture. This is Boston with this little sliver of land here, which is where BU now stands, Kenmore Square and Kenmore Station. And it was filled in around 1840. This area was filled in and became Back Bay. And called Back Bay because this was the front bay. There was the Back Bay. So the city was enlarged, and Roxbury was here, and this is where John Lowell had his farm, somewhere around here. So the next picture is India Wharf, now dismantled, now destroyed, that Francis Cabot Lowell financed when he was in the India trade. Now what was he importing? He was importing Indian cloth and Chinese silks. Now, how was it made? It was made by hand. It was hand woven. It was the thread was done by hand, and the thread was woven into silk or into cotton by hand, by thousands or tens of thousands of Chinese or by Indians in India and China. And people like Francis Cabot Lowell, the merchants of Boston, would import these goods and sell them to the local market, particularly the slave trade, because they would sell cloth to the West Indian islands and to the south. So although these people were anti-slavery, they were engaged on the side in the slave trade by providing cloth for the slaves. So this building had about, I think, 24 offices on this side and 24 offices on that side, and each merchant would buy a section of the building and store his goods on the upper floors, and this would be the warehouse down here. The offices would be here. So Francis Cabot Lowell had one of these warehouses on the wharf, on India Wharf, and that's how the trade was done. So this building was built by him and a guy called Uriah Cotting, Cotting, and a few others. They financed it and then sold the property to other merchants. And this became the center of the textile industry and other industries, importing goods from the East Indies. So even as a young man, he was importing cloth. Now, just as an aside, cloth is very important because the British Industrial Revolution was based on the discovery of machines that could make cloth. And cloth transformed the industries of Europe from handmade industries to machine-made industries, working at 5 or 10 times the speed of handmade industries. So Francis Cabot Lowell is thinking about these things and dealing with cloth and thinking in his mind, I don't know this for sure, but I feel sure, thinking, why do we make it here? And the story of Francis Cabot Lowell is going from why don't we make it here to actually making it here. So that's, while I've got time, is the rest of this talk going. Now, it didn't begin out of the blue. One of the first places in America to make thread was this factory in Beverly made by the Cabots. The Cabots, Francis Cabot Lowell, his grandfather was a Cabot. The Cabots came from Beverly and Salem, and they only talked to the Lowells. You know that famous ditty about the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk to God, something like that. But anyway, this is the Cabots built this factory. They were very entrepreneurial, and it was operated by a mule going round in circles the whole time until he dropped dead. They get another one, and that turned the machines. They're very unscientific and very poorly done. It lost money. The only thing of fame is that George Washington went through the town and made a comment about the Beverly cotton manufacturing around 1790 or thereabouts. So if you want to look for a reference of George Washington, he made some comment about this place. The next one is more famous, is one of the great inventions of the 1790s is the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, born near Worcester, Massachusetts, a graduate of Yale, who went down south to find work, and he found work on the plantation of Nathaniel Greene, his wife. Nathaniel Greene had died just after the Revolutionary War, and he noticed the slaves were picking out the cotton seeds from the cotton. And he asked a good Yankee question as, why don't you do this by machine? So he invented a very elementary machine that pulled out the cotton seeds from the cotton and made cotton the great crop of the South, which caused the increase in slavery and caused the Civil War, amongst many other things. But this is the guy who did it. And revolutionary discovery, although the actual machine is quite simplistic, although it was enlarged upon and became a very important part of the mechanization of the cotton industry. So in Rhode Island, this fellow, Mr. Brown, the founder of Brown College, Brown University, a slave trader on the side, he got the idea of weaving, of spinning thread in Rhode Island, in Pawtucket. And he hired this Englishman, next picture, Samuel Slater, who had come to America as a young man, about 21, and who had experience in England with the English machines. And he said to this guy, Brown said, can you make me a machine to weave cotton thread? And he did in Pawtucket, next picture. And this is the Pawtucket cotton factory that exists to this day. The same principle with a waterfall running the water wheel. And inside were mostly young children, child labor, and they were spinning the cotton into thread. And then they would take the thread and give it to local people who then weave it by hand into cloth. So they were halfway to Francis Cabot Lowell, but not the whole way, because Francis Cabot Lowell got into weaving as well. So this factory is still there in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I don't know if the town is bankrupt. It's one of those towns in Rhode Island that go bankrupt. But it's there, and I've never been there, but I'm going to go one day. Next one. Now, the idea of how to spin cotton. This is the guy who started it. He was a hairdresser or something like that. He was dressing hair, and maybe he got the idea of a machine that would use water power in England. Richard Arkwright used water power to make cotton thread, and he became immensely wealthy from that discovery, because all the other industries depended on him, and he became a monopolist. And the next fellow who was involved in this process was Edmund Cartwright, who was a minister, a Cambridge, honest to God, a Cambridge graduate, who wasn't very successful, and he was shown around an Arkwright machine. And somebody said to him, if you could discover a machine that could weave thread into cloth, you'd become very rich. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. And he did it. But he became bankrupt because at that time people would smash his machines, because he was the great threat to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who worked at home, weaving cotton into cloth, and they saw the end of their profession or end of their occupation, and they blamed him for it. But history, there's no turning back, and this became the norm. So the two ideas of, on the one hand, is making thread, and the other hand, making cloth. And Francis Cabot Lowell put these two together. Now, how did he do it? He came back from England. If you remember, I told you he was in England from 1810 to 1812. And he had a lot of money, because he was obsessed with money, as many Yankees then were. And I read his notes. He left a lot of notes, and somebody compiled them in order. So when I did this research, they were in order from age 5 until the day before he died. Not only were his notes in consecutive order, but the responses to him were attached to the original letters. So I wouldn't say it was a breeze, because he had a spindly handwriting. I could hardly read it. Maybe I made mistakes. I don't think so. But the first person he approached was, when he came back to Boston, was Nathan Appleton, another merchant. And Appleton said to him, "It sounds like a good idea, but I don't think it'll work." That's what I always say, you know. Don't look at book. It's like all conservative people, it's not going to work. But he said, okay, instead of £10,000, I'll give you 5,000. So he put some money into the enterprise. So he put in some money, and he talked to the other Yankees. At that time, Boston or New England was essentially a farming place with some people making money off fish, and these few merchants making a lot of money, or some did, some didn't, off export-import. And he was one of the great export importers, and Francis Cabot Lowell turned to him, and he became the first ally outside the family. The other people who contributed to fund the factory were the Jackson brothers, and they put some money in, but I think it was Francis Cabot Lowell's money that he lent them to put in, because they didn't have much money, and he had quite a lot of money. But this guy was instrumental in turning the merchants from import-export to production at home. So all this happened around 1814, and by 1830, the money in Massachusetts was in manufacturing. And factories in Lowell and in Lawrence and in Holyoke and other cities, Chicopee, the whole thing had been transformed in 30 years because it became a money maker. And as I said, he was the first one to become involved. He was also a United States representative for Massachusetts. Interesting guy. And he was the father-in-law of Longfellow. So the Longfellow house in Cambridge is what he bought for his daughter, who died when she was trying to put some candle wax on a letter, and then she lit her dress, and her dress it went up in flames, and she died. But this is Nathan Appleton. One of the interesting fellows in this whole thing is Paul Moody, who was a lowly machinist, made little machines in Amesbury. And Francis Cabot Lowell in 1814, 1815 put an ad in the local paper saying he wanted a machinist, and this guy got the job. So he came from Amesbury to Waltham and became the engineer who built the machines that Francis Cabot Lowell had seen in England and had visualized them and could describe them. So the spinning and the weaving machines in Waltham were built by this guy, by Paul Moody, who could take an idea and put it into practice. And then he built what is called the Waltham Machine Shop to build machines for other enterprises, for other cotton manufactories. So he is a very important man, and he was, let's say, undereducated by Lowell standards, but he was very smart. And he went later to Lowell and did the same thing in Lowell, and he was the director of the Lowell Machine Shop. Okay. So just very quickly, the Lowell system, what did he do? First of all, you needed a lot of money. you needed cheap power, you needed the machinery, you needed cheap raw materials, you needed good management, and you needed workers. Now, this area, including Waltham, was a small town. Waltham then was about 1,000 people, farmers. They didn't have the tens of thousands of unemployed English or Scottish workers that would flock to the factories. So they had to get the girls, the young labourers from the farms of Vermont, Maine and New Hampshire, whose parents were willing to let their daughters come on condition they earned money, and two, that they were properly cared for and properly housed. So Francis Lowell built the dormitories, or the boarding houses, that became a characteristic of the early mills. They're very paternalistic, and they were looked after by people who would take care of them, made sure the girls came home at night, and they weren't carrying on with guys, stuff like that. And these young ladies stayed generally for 4 or 5 years, earned money, went back to the farms and got married, or whatever they did. But they didn't stay there forever. They stayed there for brief periods of time. So, Francis Cabot Lowell died in 1817, at the very beginning of his idea coming into fruition. And he was buried, next picture, please, right across from the Colonial Theatre, just off Tremont Street. And if you know this area, this is Tremont Street in back of this building. And this is the old burying ground. And his bones were exhumed. What happened to bones? Exhumed in 1895, so about 110 years ago, when they're building the underground, the subway. And they dug up about 300 sets of bones, one of which was Francis Cabot Lowell, the other was his wife. And they transported them to another cemetery, to Forest Hills. So if you want to see the grave now, it's in Forest Hills, but he was buried here, which is right because he lived in Back Bay. He lived in this area. Not Back Bay, he lived off Tremont Street. That's where he was buried at age 42. Now, just quickly, his legacy. You still with me? Okay. So this is his legacy. He had one son. This is John Lowell, the Jr., the son of Francis Cabot Lowell. A bit of a failure. He wasn't anywhere near his father. His wife died when she was about 27. His children died of diphtheria. So he went off on a trip around the world to retrace the steps of Marco Polo. What he got is to India. He got to Egypt, where this picture was taken. He took with him a Swiss-born artist who would take pictures of whatever John Lowell said take a picture of, draw pictures. And one of them is this picture of John Lowell all dressed up like an Egyptian, smoking his pipe. And what he did there was buy antiquities wholesale, like 40, 50 at a time. And if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts and you look to see who the beneficiary was, he is beneficiary of some of the major pieces in the Museum of Fine Arts to this day. So he didn't know what he was buying, he just bought them up. But anyway, he died very young, and he left his money to what is called the Lowell Institute, which was sort of the beginning of the adult education movement in America, having distinguished professors talk to lay people like myself, and hundreds of people would come to listen to the Lowell lectures. And they were a phenomenon of Boston for about 100 years, until people stopped going to lectures, then they gave the money to WGBH. So WGBH is the descendant of the Lowell Institute. Now, what did John Lowell do? One of the things before he went off on this great trip is to build the Hamilton Mill in Lowell, the second great mill in Lowell. And he went there because his father, of course, was the founder of Waltham, and they named the city of Lowell after him because they had run out of water power in Waltham, and they needed a more powerful river. So they, being Nathan Appleton and Paul Moody, went up to the next great river, which is, of course, the Merrimack, and they said, we're going to found America's first industrial city here. And they said, what shall we call it? And Patrick Tracy Jackson said, let's call it Lowell. So Lowell is named for Francis Cabot Lowell, who had been dead for 5 years before that. And they built here, whoever has been to Lowell, anyone? I mean, it must have been extraordinary, these humongous factories, which had 3,000 or 4,000 workers, each of them, mostly young women, mostly Yankee girls to begin with, and then immigrant girls, immigrant people. And this is one of the great mills. It's now, I think, an apartment building. Almost done. Okay. Now, these are a few of the famous Lowells. Of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner. She married Jack Gardner, whose name really was John. She married Jack Gardner, whose name was John Lowell Gardner. He was a great-grandson of John Lowell Sr. Now, who was Gardner? Samuel Gardner was a 28-year-old man who came from Salem, and he fell in love with 15-year-old daughter of John Lowell. And he wrote his father-in-law to be, he said, it's not Anna I love, and it's not this one I love, but I love Rebecca. And his father said, she's only 15. And he said, I'll wait. So he waited 3 years, and they married. And in gratitude, the next 4 or 5 generations of sons were called John Lowell, including John Lowell Gardner, who married Isabella. And it was his money, I think, as much as hers, that built that wonderful museum on the Fenway, which is one we all know. And that's part of the legacy of the Lowells. The other legacy is Guy Lowell, who built the Museum of Fine Arts. And also, he was the architect of the Museum of Fine Arts. Okay. A few more pictures of Lowell. And this, at its prime, was the great city of Lowell with about 20 mills, huge mills, spewing coal, because by that time they'd gone from water power to steam power and burning coal, and the water became irrelevant, so they didn't need water power. They used steam power, and they polluted the whole place. Next one. And again, they put in these famous boarding houses, where they housed the young Yankee girls until the place becomes swamped with immigrants, and then they didn't give a hoot anymore. And it became catch as catch can, and Irish people and Greeks and other people came to live in Lowell and changed the city from a Yankee city to a modern industrial city. And then by about 1890, the factories began to decay. And the people who ran the factories began to send the work to the south.
Wasn't there exploitation before they did that of the immigrants?
Well, there was they were paying the immigrants next to nothing, and of course there was exploitation. But it was even cheaper in the south. So they were transferring the factories. One of the things in Lowell is they built at the Lowell machine shop these great machines that did the work. And this is one of the machines. Another couple, Linda, is another of these machines used in the cotton manufacturing. And then they got into, next, this is a picture of the Lowell girls. And so if you see a picture of the factories, there would be 100 or 200 of these weaving machines. And these young women would have to stand by the machines and supervise the machines in case the thread broke or the machine stopped working. So they were just sort of auxiliaries of the machine. And human beings have been transformed from producing things to becoming kind of adjuncts of machines. And this is one of the pictures of the Lowell machine shop where they made the machines. So not only do they make the cotton into thread and the thread into cloth, but they began to manufacture the machinery. And America, in my opinion, lost its power when it began to lose the technology and sent the work to China. And the Chinese now make the machines, and we don't make the machines anymore. And if you lose the technology, it's hard to keep up, at least in the field of cloth making and stuff like that. Okay. And this is a picture of one of the great Lowell machine shops and the hundreds and hundreds of workers who worked there. And they also made the famous engines that ran the Boston to Lowell railroad, the first railroad in Massachusetts, which took the raw cloth, the raw cotton up to Lowell and brought back the finished goods from Lowell to Boston. And from Boston, they were shipped all around the world. And a consequence of this whole thing was things like child labor. And in Lowell and in Lawrence and in Chicopee and all over, they had hundreds of kids who were 14 years of age or younger, working, doing scut work and getting paid next to nothing. The very bottom of the labor payment schedule. And I think this is the last, maybe one of the last one. This is a picture of the Merrimack Manufacturing Company in Alabama. So by 1895, the members of the board of the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, the first manufacturing company in Lowell, met in Boston and decided to open a factory in the South because labor was cheaper, they could use child labor, and they were given all kinds of benefits to open factories there. And this was the beginning of the flight of the industry from New England down to the South. And that happened to all the factories, so that by 1930 or so, Lowell was a vanquished city. But I still think Francis, is that the last one? Yeah, Francis Cabot Lowell was the man who started all this thing, and he has been dead now almost 200 years. Thank you.
French name of the Lowells was before they left France?
L-O-U-E-L-L, something like that.
Say it again, please.
I think L-O-U-E-L.
Okay, thank you. What part of France did they live in?
Oh.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
I think you make an error in the speed of the first power looms. They were slower than hand weaving. The saving was in labor. Even when you had one girl watching two looms,
Yeah.
they're low-priced labor. And later, it was one girl would watch 5 looms.
Yeah.
But they were slower because they rattled too much. The designs weren't perfected.
Oh. Well, but that didn't take long before they got it right.
There's another interesting thing about the Waltham operation. It started just before the year with no summer.
Oh, yes.
1815, and many French-Canadian families, the whole family, moved down to work in the mill in Waltham, and some went home again and some did not.
Well, I've read about this recently. The summer of 1860 throughout New England, in fact, part of the eastern seaboard, was the coldest in recorded memory, and it was freezing, and I think Vermont had 20 inches of snow, stuff like that. So many Yankees began moving out and going to Ohio. It was a reason for, I wouldn't say mass immigration, but thousands of families went away, and I guess created a vacuum for French Canadians who came, who was cold in Quebec. So.
It's also the reason that Joseph Smith's family moved from Vermont to New York State.
Yeah. Well, there was that's
It
another.
was a bad year for farmers.
It was a bad, but there was in fact the migration to the west began around 1787 when when some people from I think Salem or Beverly went to Ohio, and then the story about the Western Reserve as people from Connecticut going to Ohio. So the immigration of Yankees began around 1785 and picked up steam, if I can use that word for the coldest winter, picked up steam around 1816, and then it left a vacuum for immigrants to come in. Well, I brought some books if you'd like. They're $20 each, special price. And I'd be happy to. I've got 2 pens, and if I ran out of ink, I'll use my finger. So thank you so much. Thank you.